Hello everyone and welcome back. Finally, we're here. Part 10 of our deep dive into ancient Babylonia and Assyria. We finally get to the final video of this series. We've finished the book, and we finish out on a bang, that being the chapter on religion. Now that is an interesting topic. If you've liked it so far, well, you probably just like the video and click subscribe. There's plenty more like this to come, and you might even learn something. But let's begin now with the final chapter upon religion. As in other countries, so too in Babylonia, the official and popular religion were not all in respects the same. In the popular faith, older superstitious beliefs still lingered which had disappeared from the religion of the state, or appeared in it another form. The place of the priest was in large measure taken by the sorcerer and the magician. The ceremonies of the public cult were superseded by charms and incantations. The deities of the official creed were overshadowed by a crowd of subordinate spirits, whose very existence was hardly recognized among the more cultured classes. The Babylonian was inordinately superstitious, and superstition naturally flourished most where education flourished least. The official creed itself was an artificial amalgamation of two different currents of belief. The Babylonian race was mixed. Sumerian and Semite had gone to form it in the days before history had begun. Its religion, therefore, was equally mixed. The religious conceptions of the Sumerian and Semite differed widely, and it was the absorption of the Sumerian element by the Semitic which created the religion of the latter days. It is Semitic in its general character, but in its general character alone. In details, it resembles the religions of the other Semitic nations of Western Asia, only insofar as they have been influenced by it. The Sumerian had no conception of what we mean by a god. The supernatural powers that he worshipped or feared were spirits of material nature. Every object had its Z, or spirit, which accompanied it like a shadow. But unlike a shadow, it could act independently of the object to which it belonged. The forces of phenomena of nature were themselves spirits. The lightning which struck the temple, or the heat which parched up the vegetation of spring, were as much spirits as the Z, or spirit, which enabled the arrow to reach its mark and to slay its victim. When contact with the Semites had introduced the idea of a god among the Sumerians, it was still under the form of a spirit that their powers and attributes were conceived. The Sumerian, who had been unaffected by the Semitic teaching, spoke of their spirit of heaven rather than of the good, or the god rather, or goddess of the sky, of the spirit of A, rather than A himself, the god of the deep. Man, too, had a spirit, a Z attached to him. It was the life which gave him movement and feeling, the principle of vitality which constituted his individual existence. In fact, it was the display of vital energy in man and the lower animals from which the whole conception of Z was originally derived. The force which enables the whole conception, the whole inanimate being to breathe and act, to move and feel, was extended to inanimate objects as well. If the sun and the stars moved through the heavens, or the arrow flew through the air, it was from the same cause as that which enabled the man to walk or the bird to fly. The Z of the Sumerians was thus a counterpart of the Ka, or double of Egyptian belief. This description given by Egyptian students of the Ka would apply equally to the Z of Sumerian belief. They both belong to the same level of religious thought. Indeed, so closely do they resemble one another that the question arises whether the Egyptian belief was not derived from that of ancient Sumer. Wholly different was the idea which underlay the Semitic conception of a spiritual world. He believed in a God in whose image man had been made. It was a God whose attributes were human, but intensified in power and action. The human family on earth had its counterpart in the divine family in heaven. The side of the god stood the goddess, a colorless reflection of the god. Like the woman by the side of the man, the divine pair were accompanied by a son, the heir to his father's power, and his representative and interpreter. As man stood at the head of the created things in this world, so too the god stood at the head of all creation. He had called all things into existence, and if he chose, he could destroy them too. The Semite addressed his god as Baal, or Bel, the Lord. It was in the same title as to which is given to the head of the family, by the wife to the husband, by the servant to his master. There were as many Baalim, or Baals, as there were groups of worshippers. Each family, each clan, and each tribe had its own Baal, and when these families and clans developed into cities and states, the Baalim developed along with them. The visible form of Baal was the sun. The sun was lord of the heaven, and therewith of the earth also, and all that was upon it. But the sun presented itself under two aspects. On the one side it was the source of light and life, ripening the grain and bringing the herb into blossom. On the other hand, it parched all living things with the fierce heat of summer, and destroyed what had been brought into being. Baal, the sun god, was thus at once beneficent and malevolent. At times he looked favorably upon his adorers. At other times he was full of anger and sent plague and misfortune upon them. But under both aspects he was essentially a god of nature, and the rites with which he was worshipped accordingly were sensuous and even sensual. Such were the two utterly dissimilar conceptions of the divine, out of the union of which the official religion of Babylonia was formed. The popular religion of the country also grew out of them in a more unconscious way. The Semite gave the Sumerian his gods, with the priests and temples and ceremonies. The Sumerian gave in return his belief in a multitude of spirits, his charms and necromancy, his sorcerers and their sacred books. Unlike the gods of the Semites, the spirits of these Sumerians were not moved by human passions. They had, in fact, no moral nature. Like the objects and forces they represented, they surrounded mankind, upon whom they would inflict injury or confer benefits. But the injuries were more frequent than the benefits were. The sum of suffering and evil exceeds that of happiness in this world, more especially in a primitive condition of society. Hence the spirits were feared as demons rather than worshipped, as powers of good, and instead of a priest, a sorcerer was needed, who knew the charms and incantations, who could avert their malevolence or compel them to be serviceable to men's desire. Sumerian religion, in fact, was shamanistic, like that of some Siberian tribes today, and its ministers were shamans or medicine men skilled in witchcraft and sorcery, whose spells were potent to parry the attacks of the demon and drive him from the body of his victim, or to call him down in vengeance on the person of their enemy. Shamanism, however, pure and simple, is incompatible with an advanced state of culture. And as time went on, the shamanistic faith of the Sumerians tended towards a rudimentary form of polytheism. Out of the multitude of spirits, there were 2 or 3 who assumed a more commanding position than the rest. The spirit of the sky, the spirit of the water, and more especially the spirit of the underground world, where the ghosts of the dead and the demons of night congregated together, took precedence of the rest. Already, before the contact with the Semites, they began to assume the attributes of gods. Temples were also raised in their honor, and where there were temples, of course, there were also priests. This transition of certain spirits into gods seems to have been aided by the study of the heavens and of the heavenly bodies for which the Babylonians were immemorially famous. At all events, the ideograph which denotes a god is an 8-rayed star, from which we may perhaps infer that at the time of the invention of the picture writing, out of which the cuneiform characters grew, the gods and the stars were simply identical. One of the oldest of the Sumerian temples was that of Nippur, built in honor of Mul-Lil or El-Lil, the lord of the ghost world. He had originally been the spirit of the earth and the underground world. When he became a god, his old attributes still clung to him. To the last, he was the ruler of the Lil-Mes, the ghosts and demons who dwelt in the air and the waste places of the earth, as well as the abode of death and darkness that lay beneath it. His priests preserved the old shamanistic character. The ritual they celebrated was one of spells and incantations, of magical rites and ceremonies. Nippur was the source and center of one of those 2 great streams of religious thought and culture which influenced Sumeria and Babylonia. The other source and center was Eridu on the Persian Gulf. Here the spirit of the water was worshipped, who in process of time passed into A, the god of the deep. For the deep was a channel for foreign culture and foreign ideas. Maritime trade brought the natives of Eridu into contact with the population of other lands, and introduced new religious conceptions which intermingled with those of the Sumerians. A, the patron deity of Eridu, became the god of culture and light, who delighted in doing good to mankind and in bestowing upon them the gifts of civilization. In this he was aided by his son, Asari, who was at once the interpreter of his will and the healer of men. His office was declared in the title that was given to him of the god who benefits mankind. 2 strongly contrasted streams of religious influence thus flowed from Nippur in the north of Babylonia and from Eridu in the south. The one brought with it a belief in the powers of darkness and evil, in sorcery and magic, and a religion of fear. The other spoke of light and culture, of gods who poured blessings upon men and healed the diseases that afflicted them. Asari was addressed as he who raises the dead to life, and A was held to be the first legislator and creator of civilized society. How far the foreign influence which molded the creed of Eridu was of Semitic origin is impossible to say. Semitic influences, however, began to work upon the Sumerian religion at a very early date. The Semite and the Sumerian intermingled with each other. At first, the Semite received the elements of culture from his more civilized neighbor, but a time came when he began to give something in return. The result of this introduction of Semitic and Sumerian beliefs and ideas was the official religion of later Babylonia. The spirits, who had ranked above the rest, now became gods, in the Semitic sense of the term at least. Enlil of Nippur became the Semitic Baal or Bel, the supreme lord of the world, who governs all the world below, as well as all the world above. He it was who conferred empire over mankind upon his worshippers, and whose ministers and angels were the spirits of popular belief. He wanted but little to become a true god. His name remained unchanged, and his dominion extended to all waters, whatever, wherever they may be. His son, Asari, passed into Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, who, when his city became the capital of Babylonia, took the place of Bel-Nippur as the supreme Bel. As in Greek mythology, the younger Zeus dethroned his father. So in Babylonia, the younger Bel of Babylonia dethroned the older Bel of Nippur. Similarly, Anu, the spirit of the sky, became the Semitic sky god Anu, whose temple stood at Erech. Ur, on the western bank of the Euphrates, was dedicated to the moon god under the name of Sin, like Haram in Mesopotamia. Larsa was dedicated to the sun god. When Borsippa became the suburb of Babylon, for its presiding deity became at the same time the minister and interpreter of Marduk, under the title of Nabium or Nebo, the prophet. The Semitic god everywhere took the place of the Sumerian spirit, while those among the spirits themselves had not undergone the transforming process, merged in the 300 spirits of heaven and the 600 spirits of the earth. Eventually, they formed the hosts of heaven, of whom Bel was the supreme lord. But Semitic belief necessitated the existence of a goddess by the side of the god. It was indeed a grammatical necessity rather than a theological one. The noun in the Semitic languages has a feminine as well as masculine gender, and the masculine Belu, or Bel accordingly, implied a female Belit or Beltis. But the goddess was little more than a grammatical shadow of the god, and her position was still further weakened by the analogy of human family, where the wife was regarded as the lesser man, the slave and helpmeet of her husband. One goddess only escaped the general law, which would have made her merely the pale reflection of the god, and this was Ishtar. Ishtar was an independent deity, owing no allegiance to her husband, and standing on a footing of equality with the gods. But this was because she had once been one of the chief objects of Sumerian worship, the spirit of the evening star. In the Sumerian language, there was no gender, nothing that could distinguish the goddess or the woman from the god or the man, and the spirits, therefore, were indifferently of both sexes. Moreover, the woman occupied an important place in the Sumerian family, Where the Semitic translation speaks of a man and woman, the Sumerian originally makes it woman and man. To the Sumerian mind, accordingly, the female spirit was as powerful as the male, acting independently and possessing the same attributes. Hence it was that in taking Ishtar over from their Sumerian predecessors, the Semitic inhabitants of Babylonia took over at the same time a goddess who was the equal of a god. Among the mixed population of Babylonia, with its mixed culture and language and religion, the character and position of Ishtar underwent but little change. But when the conquerors of Sargon of Akkad and his predecessors carried the civilization of Babylonia to the west, Ishtar assumed a new form. Among the Canaanites, she became Ashtoreth, with feminine termination, and was identified with the moon, the consort and reflection, as it were, of Baal, the sun god. But even so, the existence of an independent goddess by the side of Baal seems strange to the Semitic imagination, and among the Semites of southern Arabia, she was transformed into a male goddess, while the Moabites made her one with the god Chemosh. Even among the learned classes of Semitic Babylonia, it was whispered that she was of both sexes, a goddess when imagined in the evening star, a god when visible in the star of the morning. Closely connected with the worship of Ishtar was that of Tammuz. Tammuz among the Sumerians appears to have been the spirit of the rivulets and waters of the spring, and his name signified literally the son of life, or of the spirit. But among these Semites, he had become the young and beautiful shepherd, the beloved of Ishtar, slain by the boar's tusk of winter, or, as others held, of the parching heats of the summer. He symbolized the fresh vegetation of the spring, and the sun god who called it forth. Once a year, in the sultry heats of June, the women wept and tore their hair in memory of his untimely death. And Ishtar, it is said, had descended into Hades in the vain hope of bringing him back to life. One of the most famous of Babylonian poems was that which told the descent of Ishtar through the 7 gates of the underworld, and which was chanted at the annual commemoration of his death. At each gate, it is said, the goddess left behind her some of her adornments, until at last she arrived, stripped naked, before the throne of the goddess of the infernal world. The poem was composed at a time when astronomical conceptions had laid hold of old mythology, and the poet has interwoven the story of the waning and waxing of the moon into an ancient tale. The world was generally believed to have originated out of a watery chaos, and to float, as it were, upon the deep. This belief was derived from Eridu, where it was also taught that the deep surrounded the earth like the coils of a serpent. But other ideas about the origin of things prevailed elsewhere. Inland, it was supposed that the firmament of heaven rested upon the peak of a mountain, the mountain of the east, or of the world, as it was commonly called, where the gods lived in an Olympus of their own, and the stars were suspended from it like lamps. The firmament was regarded as a kind of extinguisher, or as the upturned hull of one of the round coracles that plied upon the Euphrates. Other ideas again were prevalent in other parts of the country. Thus Eridu, the place of the mountain of the world, was taken by a magical tree which grew in the midst of the Garden of Eden or plain of Babylonia, and on either side of it were the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates. It is probably to be identified with the Tree of Life which figures so frequently in the sculptures of Assyria and on the seal cylinders of Chaldea. But it may be the Tree of Knowledge, of which we hear in the old Sumerian texts, and upon which the name of A was written. At all events, it is the holy Tree of Eridu, of whose oracle Arioch calls himself the executor. The sun, it was believed, rose and set from between the twin mountains, whose gates were guarded by men with the bodies of scorpions, while their heads touched the skies and their feet reached to Hades. The scorpion was an inhabitant of the desert of northern Arabia, the land of Mas, where the mountains of the sunset were imagined to be. Beyond them were the encircling ocean and the waters of death, and beyond these again the island of the blessed, where the favorites of the gods were permitted to dwell forever. It was hither that Xisuthros, the Chaldean Noah, was translated for his piety after the deluge. It was here, too, that the flower of immortality had blossomed. For the ordinary mortal, a very different fate was reserved. He had to descend after death into the underworld of Hades, where the spirits of the dead flitted about like bats in the darkness, with only dust for their food. It was a land of gloom and forgetfulness, defended by 7 gates and 7 wardens who prevented the dead from breaking forth from their prison and devouring the living under the form of vampires. The goddess Alat presided over it, keeping watch over the waters of life that bubbled under her golden throne. Before her sat the shade of heroes of old, each crowned with a shadowy crown, and seated on a shadowy throne, rising up only that they might salute the ghost of some human potentate that came to join them from the upper world. In latter days, it is true, brighter and higher conceptions of the afterlife came to prevail, and an Assyrian poet prays that his king, when he dies, may pass away to the land of the silver sky. The various cosmological speculations and beliefs of ancient Chaldea were collected together in later times in an attempt to combine them into a philosophical system. What this was like, we learn from the opening lines of the epic, which recounted the story of creation. In the beginning, we are told, was the chaos of the deep, which was the mother of all things. Out of it came the first primeval gods, Lakum and Lakamu, whose names had been handed down from the Sumerian age. And then came Ansar and Kisar, the upper and lower firmaments, and lastly, the great gods of the Semitic faith, Anu, Bel of Nippur, and Ea. All was ready at last for the creation of the present heavens and the earth. But a struggle had first to be carried out between the new gods of light and order and Tiamat, the dragon of the deep, the impersonation of chaos. Marduk volunteered to the task. Tiamat and her demoniac allies were overthrown and the sky formed out of her skin, while her blood became the rivers and the springs. The deep was placed under fetters, that it might never again break forth and reduce the world to its primeval chaos. Laws were laid down for the heavenly bodies, which they were to keep forever, and so to provide a measure of time, and the plants and animals of the earth were created, with man at the head to rule over them. Though man was made of the dust, he was, nevertheless, the son of the gods, whose outward forms were the same as his. It is not to be supposed that this philosophizing of the old myths and legends made its way beyond the circle of the learned classes. But the myths and legends themselves were known to the people and served instead of a cosmology. The struggle between Tiamat and Marduk was depicted on the walls of the temple of Bel at Babylon, and the belief that this world has arisen out of a victory of order over chaos and anarchy was deeply implanted in the mind of the Babylonian. Perhaps it goes back to the time when the soil of Babylonia was won by the cultivator and the engineer from the wild and unrestrained nature. Babylonian religion, of course, had its own sacred books, and like the official cosmology, a real knowledge of them was probably confined to the priests and educated classes, but a considerable part of their contents must have been more widely known. Some of the hymns embodied in them, as well as the incarnations and magical ceremonies, were doubtless familiar to the people or derived from current superstitions, the work in which the hymns were collected and procured, and which has been compared with the Veda of India, with at once the Bible and the prayer book of Chaldea. The hymns were in Sumerian, which thus became a sacred language, and any mistake in the recitation of them was held to be fatal to the validity of a religious rite. Not only, therefore, were the hymns provided with a Semitic translation, but from time to time directions were added regarding the pronunciation of certain words. The bulk of the hymns was of Sumerian origin, but many new hymns, chiefly in honor of the sun god, had been added to them in Semitic times. They were, however, written in the old language of Sumer, like Latin in the Roman Catholic Church. That alone was considered worthy of being used in the service of the gods. It was only the rubric which was allowed to be written in Semitic. The hymns and most of the prayers were in what had become to be known as the pure or sacred language of the Sumerians. Each hymn is introduced by the words "to be recited" and ends with Amanu or Amen. The religious services were incessant. Every day the sacrifice was offered, accompanied by a special ritual, and the festivals and fasts filled up each month of the year. There were services even for the nights as well as for the day. The new moons were strictly observed, and the seventh day was one of solemn rest. The very name Sabbatu, or Sabbath, was derived from the native etymologist from the Sumerian word sa, heart, and bat, to end, because it was a day for the rest of the heart. Not only were the Sabbaths on the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th days of each month, but there was also a Sabbath on the 19th, that being the end of the 7th week from the first day of the previous month. On these Sabbaths, no work was to be performed. The king, it was laid down, must not eat flesh cooked at the fire or in the smoke, must not change his clothes, must not put on white garments, must not offer sacrifices, must not drive in his chariot or issue royal decrees. Even the prophet was forbidden to practice augury or give medicine to the sick. From time to time, extraordinary days of public humiliation or thanksgiving were ordered to be observed. These were prescribed by the government and were generally the result of some political crisis or danger. When the Assyrian Empire, for instance, was attacked by the nations of the north in the early part of Esarhaddon's reign, public prayers and fasts for 100 days and 100 nights were ordained by the prophets in the hope that the sun god might remove the sin of the people and stave off the threatened attack. And so again, when Ashurbanipal had suppressed the Babylonian revolt and taken Babylon after a long siege, he tells us that, at the instance of the prophets, he purified the mercy seats and cleansed the processional roads that had been polluted. The wrathful gods and angry goddesses he appeased with special prayers and penitential psalms. The temple was erected on the ground that had been consecrated by libations of wine, oil, and honey, and was a square or rectangular building enclosing an open court, on one side of which was a ziggurat, or tower. The tower was built in successive stages, and in the topmost stage was a shrine to the god. Each tower had a name of its own, and was used for astronomical purposes. It corresponded with the high place of Canaan, the flat plain of Babylonia. It was only by the means of a tower that the worshipper could mount up to heaven, and so approach the gods. Herodotus states that the topmost story of the tower attached to the temple of Bel Merodach at Babylon contained nothing but a couch and a table. The image of the god stood in the innermost shrine, or holy of holies, of the temple itself. In front of it was the golden table, on which the shrew bread was laid, and below was the paraku, or the mercy seat, whereupon, according to Nebuchadnezzar, at the festival of the new year on the 8th and 11th days, the king of the gods of heaven and earth, Bel the gods, seats himself, while the gods of the heaven and earth reverently regard him, standing before him with bowed heads. It was the seat of the oracles, which was derived from it by God to his ministering priests. In front of the shrine was an altar cased in gold, and another altar stood in the outer court. Here also was the great basin of bronze for purification purposes, which was called the Deep, and corresponded with the Sea of Solomon's temple. Like the latter, it sometimes stood on the heads of 12 bronze oxen, as we learn it from a hymn in which the construction of one of these basins is described. They were supposed to represent the primeval deep out of which the world had arisen, and on which still floats. The chapel found by Mr. Hormund Rassam at Balawat near Nineveh gives us some idea of what the inner shrine of a temple was like. At its northwest end was an altar approached by steps, while in front of the latter, and near the entrance, was a coffer or ark in which 2 small slabs of marble were deposited, 12½ inches long and 8 wide, on which the Assyrian king Assur-Nazir-Pal, in a duplicate text, records his erection of the sanctuary. It is not surprising that when the Nestorian workmen found the tablets, they believed that they had discovered the 2 tablets of the laws of Moses. The temple sometimes enclosed a Bit Eli or Beth El. This was originally an upright stone consecrated by oil and believed to be the inanimation of a divine spirit. The black stone in the Kaaba of the Temple of Mecca is still a surviving example of the veneration paid by the Semitic nations to sacred stones. Whether, however, the Bel Ils of later Babylonian days were like the black stone of Mecca, really the consecrated stones that once served as temples, well, we do not know. In any case, they were anchored within the walls of the temples, which had taken their place as the seats of worship of the gods. Offerings were still made to them in the age of Nebuchadnezzar and his successors. Thus we hear of the 765 measures of grain, which were paid as dues to the Beth El, by the serfs of one of the Babylonian temples. The measure, it may be stated, was an old measure of capacity, retained among the peasantry, and only approximately exact. It was calculated to contain from 41 to 43 cars. The offerings of the gods were divided into sacrifices and meal offerings. The sheep, ox, lamb, and dove were offered in sacrifice. Fruit, vegetables, bread, wine, oil, and spices, where no blood was required to be shed. There were also sin offerings and heave offerings. When the offering was first lifted up before the gods, a contract dated in the 32nd year of Nebuchadnezzar tells something about the parts of the animals which were sacrificed, though unfortunately the meaning of many of the technical words is still unknown. It goes thus. Iskur-Merodach, the son of Imbria, the son of Ile-Merodach, of his own free will, has given to the future to Nebo-Balassu-Ikbi, the son of Kudinu, the son of Ile-Merodach, the slaughterers of the oxen and the sheep, for the sacrifices of the king, the prescribed offerings, the peace offerings of the whole year, the gall round the heart, the covering of the ribs, the mouth and the stomach, as well as during the year 7,000 sin offerings and 1,000 sheep before Ishtar, who dwells in the temple of Satura in Babylon, not excepting the soft parts of the flesh, the trotters, the juicy meat, and the salted flesh, and all the slaughterers of the oxen, sheep, birds, lambs due on the 8th day of Nisan, and the heave offering of an ox and a sheep before the Papsukal and Bid-Gidutskani, the temple of Nin-Ip, and the temple of Anu on the further bank of the new town in Babylon. The 8th of Nisan, or March, was the first day of the festival of the new year. The hierarchy of priests was large. At its head was the patesi, or high priest, who in the early days of Babylonian history was a civil as well as an ecclesiastical ruler. He lost his temporal power with the rise of the kings, but at first the king was also a patesi, and it is probable that in many cases at least it was the high priest who made himself a king by subjecting to his authority the patesis or priestly rulers of other states. In Assyria, the change of the high priest into a king was accompanied by revolt from the supremacy of Babylonia. With the establishment of a monarchy, the high priest lost more and more his old power and attributes, and tended to disappear altogether, or to become merely the vice-regent or representative of the king. The king himself, mindful of his origin, still claimed semi-priestly powers, but he now called himself a sangu, or chief priest, rather than a patesi. In fact, the latter name was retained only from antiquarian motives. The individual high priest passed away and was succeeded by the class of chief priests. Under them were several subordinate classes of temple servants. There were, for instance, the Enu, or the elders, and the Pasisu, the anointers, whose duty it was to anoint the images of the gods and the sacred vessels of the temple with oil, and who are sometimes included among the Ramku, or the offerers of libations as well. By the side of them stood Asipu, or prophet, who interpreted the will of heaven, and even accompanied the army on its march, deciding when it might attack the enemy with success, or when the gods refused to grant it victory. Next to the prophet came the Maku, or interpreter of dreams, as well as the Baru, or seer. A very important class of temple servants were the Kali, or eunuch priests, the Gali of the religions of Asia Minor. They were under a chief Kalu, and were sometimes entitled the servants of Ishtar. It was indeed to her worship that they were specially consecrated, like the Ukatu and Karimatu, or female hierodules. Erech, with its sanctuary of Anu and Ishtar, was the place where these latter and chiefly were to be found. Here they performed their dances in honor of the goddess, and mourned over the death of Tammuz. Closely connected with the Kali was a sort of monastic institution, which seems to have been attached to some of the Babylonian temples. The Zikari who belonged to it were forbidden to marry, and it is possible that they were eunuchs just like the Kali. They too were under a chief or president, and their main duty was to attend to the daily sacrifice and to minister to the higher order of priests. In this respect, they resembled the Levites at Jerusalem. Indeed, they are frequently termed servants in their inscriptions, though they were neither serfs nor slaves. They could be dedicated to the service of the sun god from childhood. A parallel to the dedication of Samuel is to be found in a deed dated at Sippara on the 21st of Nisan in the 5th year of Cambyses, in which Umu Dabat, the daughter of Nebo Bel Uzur, whose father-in-law was the priest of the sun god, is stated to have brought her 3 sons to him, and to have made the following declaration before another priest of the same deity. My sons have not yet entered the house of males, Zikari. I have hitherto lived with them. I have grown old with them since they were small, until they have been counted among men. Then she took them into the house of the males, and gave them to the service of the god. We learn this from other documents that the Zikari lived together in a monastery or cottage within the walls of the temple, and that monthly rations of food were allotted to them from the temple revenues. The ordinary priests were married, though the wife of a priest was not herself a priestess. There were priestesses, however, as well as female recluses, who, like the Zikari, were not allowed to marry and were devoted to the service of the sun god. They lived in the temple, but were able to hold property of their own, and even to carry business with it. A portion of the profits, nevertheless, went to the treasury temple, out of whose revenue they were themselves supplied with food. From contracts of the time of Hammurabi, we gather that many of them not only belonged to the leading families of Babylonia, but that they might be relations with the king. Wholly distinct from these devotees of the sun god were the female hierodules, or the night workers of Ishtar, to whom reference has already been made. Distinct from them again were the prophetesses of Ishtar, who prophesied the future and interpreted the oracles of the goddess. One of the chief seats was the temple of Ishtar at Arbela, and a collection of the oracles had been delivered by them, and their broader prophets to Esarhaddon had been preserved. It is thus that he is addressed on one of them. Fear not, Esarhaddon, the breath of inspiration which speaks to thee is spoken by me. I conceal it not. Thine enemies shall melt away from before thy feet like the floods in Sivan. I am the mighty mistress, Ishtar of Arbela, who have put thine enemies to flight before thy feet. Where are the words which I speak unto thee? that thou hast not believed them. I am Ishtar of Arbela. Thine enemies, the Ukians, do I give unto thee. I am Ishtar of Arbela. In front of thee, and at thy side do I march. Fear not, thou art in the midst of those who can heal thee. I am in the midst of thy host. I advance, and I stand still. It is probable that these prophetesses were not ordained to their office, but that it depended on their position of the spirit of inspiration. At all events, we find men as well as women acting as the mouthpieces of Ishtar. And in one instance, the woman describes herself as a native of a neighboring village in the mountains. The revenues of the temples and priesthood were derived partly from endowments, partly from compulsory or voluntary offerings. Among the compulsory offerings were the esra, or tithes. These had to be paid by all classes of the population, from the king downward, either in grain or in its equivalent of money. The tithe of Nabonidus, immediately after his accession to the temple of the sun god at Sippara, was as much as 5 manes of gold. We may infer from this that it was paid on the amount of cash that he had found in the treasury of the palace, and which was regarded as the private property of the king. 9 years later, Belshazzar, the heir apparent, offered 2 oxen and 32 sheep as a voluntary gift to the same temple. And at the beginning of the following year, we find him paying a shekel and a quarter for a boat to convey 3 oxen and 24 sheep to the same sanctuary. Even at the moment when Cyrus was successfully invading the dominions of his father, and Babylon had already been occupied for 3 weeks by the Persian army, Belshazzar was careful to pay the tithe due from his sister, amounting to 47 shekels of silver, into the treasury of the sun god. As Sippara was in the hands of the enemy, the Babylonian forces, which Belshazzar commanded, had been defeated and dispersed. The fact is very significant, and proves how thoroughly bold the invaders and invaded must have recognized the rights of the priesthood. Tithe was also indirectly paid by the temple serfs. Thus, in the first year of Nergal-Sharezer, out of 3,100 measures of grain delivered by the serfs of the sun god to his temple at Sippara, 250 were extracted as tithe. These serfs must have distinguished from the temple slaves. They were attached to the soil and could not be separated from it. When therefore a piece of land came into the possession of a temple by gift or an endowment, they went along with it, but their actual persons could not be sold. The slave, on the other hand, was as much a chattel as the furniture of the temple, which could be bought and sold. He was usually a captive taken in war, more rarely a nation who had been sold for debt, a native, rather, who had been sold for debt. All the menial work of the temple was performed by him. The cultivation of the temple hands, on the contrary, was left to the serfs. It is doubtful whether the butchers or slaughterers of the animals required for sacrifice, or the bakers of the sacred cakes, were slaves or freedmen. The expressions used in regard to them in the contract of Izkur Merodach, quoted above, is open to 2 interpretations, but it would naturally signify that they were regarded as slaves. We know, at all events, that many of the artisans employed in weaving curtains for the temples and clothing for the images of the gods belonged to the servile class. And the gorgeousness of the clothing and frequency with which it was changed must have necessitated a very large number of workmen. Many of the documents which have been bequeathed to us by the archives of the temple of the sun god at Sippara relate to the robes and headdresses and other portions of the clothing and images which stood there. A considerable part of the property of a temple was inland. Sometimes this was managed by the priests themselves. Sometimes its revenues were farmed, usually by a member of the priestly corporation. At other times it was let to wealthy tenants. One of these, Nebo Sumyukin by name, who was one of the officials in the temple of Nebo at Borsippa, married his daughter Gigitum to Nergal-Sharazar in the first year of the latter's reign. The state religion of Assyria was a copy of that of Babylonia, but it had one important exception. The supreme god was the deified state. Assur was not a Baal any more than Yahweh was in Israel at Chemosh or Moab. He was, consequently, no father of a family. With a wife and a son, he stood alone in jealous isolation, wifeless and childless. It is true that some learned scribes steeped in Babylonian learning now and then tried to find a Babylonian goddess with whom to mate him, but the attempt was merely a piece of theological pedantry, which made no impression on the rulers and people of Nineveh. Assur was supreme over all the other gods. As his representative, the Assyrian king was supreme over all kings of the earth, and he would brook no rival at his side. The tolerance of Babylonian religion was unknown in Assyria. It was through trust in Assur that the Assyrian armies went forth to conquer, and through his help they gained their victories. The enemies of Assyria were his enemies, and it was to combat and overcome them that the Assyrian monarchs declare that they marched to war. Cyrus tells us that Bel-Merodach was wrathful because the images of other deities had been removed by Nabonidus from their ancient shrines in order to be gathered together in his temple at Asagil in Babylon. But Assur bade his servants to go forth to subdue the gods of other lands, and to compel their worshippers to transfer their allegiance to the god of Assyria. Those who believed not in him were his enemies, and they were to be extirpated or punished. It is true that the leading Babylonian divinities were acknowledged in Assyria by the side of Assur, but they were subordinate to him, and it is difficult to resist the impression that their recognition was mainly confined to that of the literary classes. Apart from the worship of Ishtar and the use of the names of certain gods in time-honored formulas, it is impossible whether even the knowledge of the Babylonian deities went much beyond the educated members of the Assyrian community. Nebo and Merodach and Anu were the gods of literature rather than of a popular cult. But even in Babylonia, the majority of the gods of the state religion was probably little but remembered by the mass of the people. Doubtless the local divinity was well known to the inhabitants of the place over which he presided, and where his temple had stood from immemorial times. Every native of Ur was doubtless a devoted adorer of Sin, the moon god, and for the inhabitants of Babylon, Bel-Merodach was the highest object of worship. But the real religion of the bulk of the population consisted in charms and magic. The Babylonian was intensely superstitious, the cultivated classes as much as the lowest. Sorcery and divination were not only tolerated by priests, but they formed part of the religious system of the state. Prophets and diviners and interpreters of dreams served in the temples, and one of the sacred books of the priesthood was a collection of incantations and magical rites. Among the people, generally of the old shamanistic faith, had never been eradicated. It was but partially overlaid with the religious conceptions of the Semite, and sorcery and witchcraft flourished down to the last days of Babylonian history. The gods and goddesses were believed to utter oracles and predictions through the lips of inspired men and women. Figures of winged bulls and serpents were placed at the entrance of a building to prevent demons of evil from passing through it. Before the gates of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar set up mighty bulls of bronze and serpents which stood erect. And when Nabonidus restored the temple of the moon god at Haran, 2 images of the primeval god, Lakum, were similarly erected on either side of its eastern gate to drive back his foes. These protecting genii were known as Sedi and Kurubi and Shedim and Cherubim of the Old Testament. Sedi, however, was a generic term, including evil as well as beneficent genii, and the latter was more properly classed as the Lamasi or colossal forms. The whole world was imagined to be filled with malevolent spirits, ever on the watch to attack and torment mankind. The water that was drunk, the food that was eaten, it might contain a demon whom it would be necessary to exorcise. The diseases that afflict our bodies, the maladies that prey upon our spirits, were all due to the spirits of evil, and could be removed only by the proper incantations and charms. Madness and epilepsy were more especially the direct effect of demoniac possession. The magician alone knew how to cure them, and the priest taught that his knowledge had first been communicated to him by the god A through his interpreter, Marduk. Books were written containing the needful formulae and ritual for counteracting the malevolence of the evil spirits and for healing the sick. Pure or holy water and the number 7 were regarded as endowed with mysterious power in the performance of these magical rites. Thus, magical threads were ordered to be bound 7 times round the limbs of the sick man, with phylacteries attached to them, which were inscribed with sentences from a holy book. It was at night time that the spirits of evil were more especially active. It was then that vampires escaped from the bodies of the dead, or from the realm of Hades to suck the blood of the living, and that the nightmare lay upon the breast of its victim and sought to strangle him. At the head of these demons of night was Lilat, the wife of Lil, the ghost. From the Babylonians, she was borrowed by the Jews, and it appears in the book of Isaiah under the name of Lilith. The demons were serviced by a priesthood of their own. These were the wizards and witches, the sorcerers and sorceresses, with whom were associated the public night walkers who plied their calling under the shadow of night. It was then that they lay in ambush for the unwary passenger, for whom they mixed deadly philters with poisoned blood. They were the devotees of Ishtar, but the Ishtar they worshipped was a wholly different goddess from the Ishtar of the official cult. She was a goddess of witchcraft and darkness, of whom it was said that she seized her victim at night and was the slayer of youth. She it was who was dreaded by the people, like the witches and street walkers who ministered before her, and against whom exorcisms of all kinds were employed. To guard against her and her agents, small images of Lugalgira and Alamu, the teraphim of the Babylonians, were made and placed to the right and left of the door, that they might tear out the hearts of the wicked and slay the witch. The fire god, moreover, was invoked that he might destroy the ministers of wickedness. And figures of the witch or wizard were moulded in wax and melted in the fire. As the wax dissolved, so it was prayed, might the wizard and witch run, melt, and dissolve. The exorcisms had to be repeated by the victims of witchcraft. This is clear from the words which come at the end of each of them, as follows: I, so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, whose god is so-and-so, and goddess so-and-so, I turn to thee, I seek to thee, I kiss thy hands, I bow myself unto thee, consume the wizard and the witch, annihilate the lives of the sorcerer and the sorcerers who have bewitched me. Then I shall live and gladden thy heart. In strange contrast to these utterances of popular superstition are the hymns and prayers that were addressed by the cultivated Babylonian to the gods of the official creed. They were the gods of light and healing, who punished indeed the sins of the wicked, but were ready to listen to the petitions of the penitent and forgive them for their transgressions. Bel-Merodach was the merciful one, who raises the dead to life, and A was ever on the watch to send aid to suffering humanity and foil the demons who warred against man. Here, for example, are some extracts from one of those penitential psalms whose author seemed to have sprung from Eridu, and which formed part of the Babylonian Bible long before the age of Abraham. The heart of my Lord is wroth. May it be appeased. May the God whom I know not be appeased. May the goddess whom I know not be appeased. May both the God I know and the God I know not be appeased. O Lord, my sins are many, transgressions great. The sin that I sinned, I knew not. The transgression I committed, I knew not. The Lord in the wrath of his heart has regarded me. God, in the fierceness of his heart, has revealed himself to me. I sought for help, and none took my hand. I wept, and none stood at my side. I cried aloud, and there was none that heard me. I am in trouble and hiding. I dare not look up. To my God, the merciful one, I turn myself and utter my prayer. The feet of my goddess I kiss and water with tears. The sins I have sinned turn into a blessing. The transgressions I have committed let the wind carry away. Strip off my manifold wickedness as a garment. O my God, 7 times 7 are the transgressions, forgive my sins. O my goddess, 7 times 7 are my transgressions, forgive my sins. To the same early period belongs a hymn to the moon god, originally composed for the services in the temple of Ur, the birthplace of Abraham, and afterwards incorporated in the sacred books of the state religion. It is thus that the poet speaks of the god. Father, long suffered and full of forgiveness, whose hand upholdeth the life of mankind, firstborn omnipotent, whose heart is immensity, and there is none who may fathom it. In heaven, who is supreme? Thou alone, thou art supreme. On earth, thou alone, thou art supreme. As for thee, thy will is made known in heaven, and the angels bow their faces. As for thee, thy will is known upon earth, and the spirits below kiss the ground. At times, the language of the hymn rises to that of monotheism and a pure and exalted character. That a monotheistic school actually existed in one of the literary circles of Babylonia long ago is pointed out by Sir Henry Rawlinson. It arose at Erech, an early seat of Semitic influence, and endeavored to resolve the manifold deities of Chaldea into the forms or manifestations of the one God Anu. It never made any converts, it is true, but the tendency towards monotheism continued among the educated. And when Babylonia became the capital of the country, its god Marduk, not only Bel or Lord, but the one supreme Lord of all the other gods. Though the existence of other gods was admitted, they fell, as it were, into a background of shadow, and the worshipper of Marduk and his devotion to the god almost forgot that they existed at all. The prayers of Nebuchadnezzar are a proof of how narrow was the line to which divided his faith from that of the monotheist. To Marduk, my lord, he says, I prayed. I began to him my petition. The word of my heart sought him, and I said, O Prince, thou that art from everlasting, Lord of all that exists, for the King whom lovest, whom thou callest my name, as it seems good unto thee, thou guidest his name aright, thou watchest over him in the path of righteousness. I, the Prince who obeys thee, am the work of thy hands. Thou hast created me, and thou hast entrusted me the sovereignty of multitudes of men, according to thy goodness. O Lord, which thou hast made to pass over them all. Let me love thy supreme lordship. Let the fear of the divinity exist in my heart, and give what seemeth good unto thee, since thou maintainest my life. The man who could thus pray was not far away from the kingdom of God. And just like that, can you believe it? We're at the end of the series. 10 videos. Now that ought to give you a good background on Babylonia. It's fascinating, isn't it? I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording it. It's been a bit of hard work, but you know that, well, I don't shy away from that. I'd like to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Star Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuronerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, J.R., Charlene, and Christopher. Thank you very much. And I will see you on the next exciting episode. Well, I suppose it'll be a different episode. It won't be back to Babylonia. Well, I suppose I could do more videos about Babylonia, but I think we've done enough Babylonian videos for a while. Maybe we'll come back to it later. Either way, let me wish you all a very fond farewell. And as always, lots of love to all of you, all over the world. Good night.